Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. Hi. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I am very pleased to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Forum on the findings of the California Reparations Task Force with Task Force Chairwoman Kamilah Moore and Dr. Brenda Stevenson. If you'd like to receive reminder emails about our upcoming events, please sign up for our email list with one of the ushers, or you can always find out more on our website. You can also find recordings of most of our past public programs on the Hammer website, and you will be able to find this one in about 2 days. And feel free to share it with friends. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum Family Foundation. In today's forum, we're going to be talking about reparations. In September of 2020, a few months after the brutal murder of George Floyd, California became the first state in the nation to form a governmental reparations task force to study and develop restitution and reconciliation proposals for African Americans. In 2023, the committee released its final report with recommendations of how the state should atone for its history of racial violence and discrimination against Black residents. Their report is an important historic document and the result of several years of hearings, research, negotiations, and writing. The result is a clear and thorough document describing slavery in California's early history and the ongoing legacy of slavery experienced by Black Californians today. And we do have the report itself is 1,800 pages. There is an executive summary of the report, which is 74 pages, and we have printed out several copies, and they're available in the theater lobby for you if you'd like to take one. And the entire report is available on the California government website. This QR code will lead you to both the executive summary as well as the complete report. So when the report was released, I expected it to be a major national topic of discussion. I figured there'd be think pieces in all the important newspapers and magazines. The participants will be interviewed on talk shows and on news programs, and it would prompt a real national discussion. Instead, it was barely a blip on the news cycle. Even the Black press, it was released without much fanfare. So we felt it was important to have an evening to hear about what the process was for the task force to develop its findings and what its final recommendations are. I was thrilled when the young, brilliant attorney who chaired the task force, Kamilah Moore, agreed to come and present in the Hammer Forum. The Hammer's done 2 prior programs looking at reparations for slavery in the United States, and both were moderated by the eminent historian, Dr. Brenda Stevenson, and luckily she agreed to come back to the Hammer again for tonight's program. I want to mention that when the Hammer posted about tonight's program on Instagram, there was a lot of response, and not all of it was positive. People seem to have a knee-jerk reaction against the idea of reparations. So I'm going to mention a few of their objections, and hopefully we'll address these concerns in today's program. Some people said there was never slavery in California, so this is just unnecessary. False. Some people said there is no way to know who came from an enslaved family, so there's no point. And I know that that was actually a big discussion, is how do you determine who's entitled to reparations? I know that's something the task force really struggled with, and they will address that today. Others said that slavery was so long ago that it's irrelevant, and many, many people seemed to automatically associate the word reparations with the idea of cash, as opposed to other ways of having reparations, including healthcare, education, etc. So tonight we'll begin with a short presentation by Chairwoman Kamilah Moore here at the podium, and then she'll be joined by Dr. Stevenson for a conversation, and then we'll take audience questions, and afterwards I'd like to invite you all to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies out in the theater lobby, and we can talk about these ideas further. So now I'll introduce our speakers. Kamilah Moore is a reparations justice scholar and an attorney with a specialization in entertainment and intellectual property transactions. As a law student, she contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil, the human right to sanitation in Alabama, and human rights for indigenous Black women affected by racialized gender violence in Papua New Guinea. While studying at the University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master's thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparations justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia Law School, a Master of Law degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's from here at UCLA. Kamilah Moore was appointed to the California Reparations Task Force by Speaker of the Assembly Anthony Rendon. Dr. Brenda Stevenson is an internationally recognized scholar of race, slavery, gender, family, and racial conflict. The ways in which race and gender interact, intersect, collide with, emphasize, run parallel to, and sometimes isolate one another are at the center of her work. She is the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women's History at St. John's College, Oxford University, as well as the Nickel Family Endowed Chair in the Department of History and a Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. In her role as the Clinton Chair at Oxford, as well as her work at UCLA, Stevenson actively works to demonstrate that the study of women and their histories, particularly those which address women of color, is both valuable and legitimate. Dr. Stevenson's book-length publications include the journals of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots, and What is Slavery? Her latest book is What Sorrows Labor in My Parents' Breast, A History of the Enslaved Black Family. And we just had a program last week talking about that book. Sorry. So now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Task Force Chairwoman Kamilah Moore to the stage. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. My name is Kamilah Moore, and I served as a past chairperson of the First in the Nation California Reparations Task Force. So I prepared a short presentation for you all, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with the esteemed and one and only Dr. Stevenson. So without further ado, where do we show this slide? And so this presentation is called On the Badges and Incidents of Slavery. That is a term that goes back all the way to the Reconstruction era, but the task force identified 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that still persists in the society today in the United States and in California. And we identified the 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that justifies the need for reparations for descendants of slaves in the state and in the country. And we call those 12 major areas the 12 major badges and incidents of slavery. Next slide. Oh, I can do it myself, sorry. So AB 3121 authorized the task force to hold public hearings to pursue its mission. In order to inform the contents of the final report, the task force held 16 public meetings during which it considered public comments, expert and personal witness testimony, in addition to considering the voluminous materials submitted to the task force via email from those unable to attend the meeting. The task force is officially over, but as of June 28th, 2023, that's when we had our last meeting. The task force heard over 80 hours of testimony from over 150 witnesses, over 30 hours of public comment. Our hearings were, those 16 hearings, there was 2 days each from 9 to 5 each day. And we received over 3,000 emails and over 300 phone calls. Just to give a little bit more background on how this task force came to be, Secretary of State, California Secretary of State Shirley Weber, who's the state's first African-American Secretary of State, she was once in the state assembly, and as an assembly member, she introduced legislation called AB 3121 because one of her interns, who was very passionate about reparations, a Black woman named Maureen Simmons, came to Assemblymember Weber at the time with this novel idea to have a reparations task force on the state level. And so Shirley Weber introduced AB 3121, which is almost a carbon copy of HR 40, which is a reparations legislation that has been languishing in Congress for almost 40 years. And so yes, AB 3121 was championed by Secretary of State Shirley Weber and grassroots activists and was signed into law September 30th, 2020. characterized the 2 years of our work. The first year was the study phase, and the second year was the development phase. The study phase, that's when we invited over 150 witnesses or so to share personal and expert testimony on those 12 major areas of systemic discrimination, on those lingering badges of incidents of slavery. And the second and final year, the 9-member task force, we kind of stopped inviting folks and we're just having really hard conversations amongst the 9 of us about what the final recommendations should be based on what we learned during the study phase. And the task force concluded again June 28th, 2023, when we presented our final report to the California State Legislature. The task force is was a legislative advisory body. So our role was advising the state legislature on the types of reparations proposals that they should turn into legislation and that Governor Newsom should then sign into law. And so we finished our work by handing off that final report to the state legislature in Sacramento, June 28th, 2023. And now it's up to them to study our report with an open heart and mind. And when they return back to the legislature later this winter, early 2024, they will be introducing legislation based on our over 100 recommendations. Just to give a little bit of background about what is reparations, right? The layman's terms definition of reparations is, simply just making amends for harm done. As someone who studied international law, that's some of the one of the forms of the international legal definition for reparations. There's 5 forms of reparations under international law. Most Americans, when they think about reparations, they think about just cash, but there's also restitution. You can think about Manhattan Beach, the Bruce Beach example as a form of restitution, where the descendants of the Bruces were able to get their land back, although they, sold it for cash. That's still a type of reparation under the form of restitution. You also have rehabilitation, so that looks like, could be free medical services from cradle to grave, psychological services, things like that. Satisfaction is the 4th form of reparations, and that's more symbolic, like a formal apology for any harm done. The taking down of Confederate monuments and putting up in their stead, monuments that may honor, African American history or just things like that. And then the 5th form of reparations under international law is guarantees of non-repetition, which is one of the hardest forms of reparations to achieve under international law, because it's alluding to how do you get the state to promise or get the state to stop harming the victim group. Often this form also talks about or alludes to institutional and policy, structural policy change. Some domestic examples of reparations include, Ronald Reagan in the late 1980s signed off to allow for Japanese American internment camp survivors to receive $25,000 in cash for their suffering, although we know that was not nearly enough. And Rosewood, Florida State Legislature still to this day allows African American descendants of the Rosewood Race Massacre free state college tuition to Florida state schools and universities. And some international examples include the denazification of Nazi Germany after World War II. And a very limited example, you could even say direct victims of police brutality during the South Africa apartheid regime. However, I say very limited because we know the masses, the Black masses, never received any repair or acknowledgement of their harms during the apartheid regime. This is pretty small text, but this just gives you a quick overview of some of the hearings that the task force had or held over the course of the 2 years. Again, we invited folks to give personal and expert testimony on the major areas of systemic discrimination. And we substantively started our conversations, of course, around the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migration. What made Black folks want to leave the South or force Black folks to come to the West, and what did they experience when they got here? And then we also, again, held hearings on discrimination in housing, banking, tax, labor, gentrification, infrastructure, and homelessness. Since we're in California, we talked about entertainment, sports, arts, and culture. Separate and unequal education, the criminal legal system, discrimination in technology, and international law as well. And this to the left is a picture of the signing ceremony. You'll see Governor Newsom, Attorney General Bonta's there. You have Supervisor Holly Mitchell, Secretary of State Shirley Weber, and many grassroots activists who were part of the effort. To the right, you have the 9-member task force, which comprises of clergy like Vice Chair Amos Brown, to the bottom right, who is one of 16 students to be taught by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. You have academics like Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, who is a director of geography studies at UC Berkeley. You have renowned psychologists like Cheryl Grills from LMU, elected officials, Monica Montgomery Stepp out of San Diego, City Council, Assembly Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, State Senator Stephen Bradford. And then you also have Don Tamaki, who helped to overturn Korematsu versus the U.S. And his parents were also incarcerated and received reparations as well. So getting to the report, what is the thesis essentially of the report? I won't read all through this, but essentially, and you can find this in the executive summary of our report, essentially what we start to discuss, we open the report by talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That instance in which slaves began to become free en masse, but then we also start having a contextual conversation. What was happening during that time? We talk about Senator Lyman Trumbull, who was a radical Republican who was part of, pushing for some type of sustenance and resources for newly freed slaves. And he was quoted at that time saying, it is perhaps difficult to draw the precise line to say where freedom ceases and slavery begins. So there were, people in Congress, good-hearted people who were contemplating, how do you help this, soon to be newly freed group of people, and how do you transition them from pure subjugation to freedom, right? What is the government's role in helping these folks in this group in that transition? And so then the task force, we talk about that brief period of Reconstruction in this country that only lasted no more than 12 years, when actually the federal government, Congress, actually did allocate resources to help this group, newly freed slaves, transition into freedom. One of the examples that from this period that reflect this expansion of rights, for instance, is by 1868, more than 700,000 African American men were registered to vote in former Confederate states. However, due to the Compromise of 1875, you saw the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, which left Black Americans to have to fend for themselves. And so that brief glimpse of hope within that 12-year period where you saw, the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Bank, Freedmen's Schools, this acknowledgement from Congress that there was something that needed to be done to assist this group in this very incredible transition, that was all kind of pretty much erased. All that progress was completely erased due to that compromise effectively ending Reconstruction. Also, just to give a little bit more context before I continue, you even had in 1883 the U.S. Supreme Court, via the civil rights cases, pretty much telling Congress, Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, we know about Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, right? We can give credit to Ava DuVernay for helping the mainstream understand Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, that's about the crime exception, right? You can be a slave or be in this country if you're convicted of a crime. But Section 2 is not very well known, and it's about it's an enabling clause. It allows Congress to enforce Section 1. And in the civil rights cases of 1883, you have the Supreme Court essentially trying to articulate that Section 2 power. And in that case, you have the Supreme Court saying the 13th Amendment as empowering Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery in the United States. But that begs the question, right? And the conclusion that we came up with essentially is that U.S. Congress has failed to acknowledge that any badges and incidents of slavery exist. So thus, how can they even define it if they haven't even acknowledged it? And if they haven't even acknowledged it or defined it, how can they work to eradicate it? And so that's the intervention of the task force. We were essentially doing the work of Congress. I told you how H.R. 40 has been languishing in Congress for 40 years. AB 3121 was a carbon copy of H.R. 40. If H.R. 40 had passed, they would be doing on the national level what the task force had done in this past 2 years. Just taking a step back, there are 13th Amendment legal scholars who are doing the work that Congress should be doing in terms of defining what these lingering badges and incidents of slavery are based on, the 1883 civil rights cases. And we invited, for instance, law professor Jennifer Mason McAward to come share about her seminal piece defining the badges and incidents of slavery, because she has come up with a very interesting definition that we took on as a task force. And she defined the badges and incidents of slavery as public or widespread action aimed at any racial group or population that has previously been held in slavery or servitude, that mimics the law of slavery and has a significant potential to lead to the de facto re-enslavement or legal subjugation of the targeted group. And then she goes on to say, advising Congress, this limited definition will assist Congress in identifying ways in which it can fulfill the 13th Amendment's promise of universal civil and political freedom. At the same time, it will provide judicially enforceable limits for the exercise of the Section 2 power. So essentially, Professor Mason McAward is arguing if Congress, at the very least, acknowledges badges and incidents of slavery exist, they can use this definition to start doing prophylactic legislation, introducing legislation that works to eradicate any lingering badges and incidents of slavery that still persist in this society. But they still haven't done that. And that's the thesis of our final report. We found that throughout the rest of American history, instead of abolishing the badges and incidents of slavery, the United States federal, state, and local governments, including the state of California, have actually perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. The resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed over generations. And so this final report focuses on these harms so thoroughly, we say in our executive summary, how the effects of slavery infected every aspect of American society over the last 400 years, that it's nearly impossible to identify every single badge or incident of slavery, to include every single piece of harm done to African Americans. So in order to address this practical reality, the final report of the task force, we just described just a sample of government actions and compounding harms in just 1,000 pages. And we organized it into 12 specific areas, as I said at the top of the presentation. 12 major areas of systemic discrimination, 12 major badges and incidents of slavery. Historically, some of these badges and incidents of slavery have manifested into, for instance, in the state, proliferation of KKK chapters and meetings, redlining, whites-only towns and neighborhoods, laws and ordinances supporting segregation in schools. So as I said, in terms of the organization of the report, there's 13 chapters, substantive chapters. The first chapter is on enslavement. Each of the chapters, there's a California section and a national section. The California section obviously just is all about California-specific history, and then the national section takes a more national scope, because we understood kind of our role as being the first kind of state in the nation to do this and actually, Congress hasn't done it. So we were kind of even wanting to not just focus on California in this report, but also have a bit of a national scope as well, kind of understanding our place in this moment. And so after the enslavement chapter, as I said, are the 12 remaining chapters, are those 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that we're calling badges and incidents of slavery. And I'll quickly go through each one. So enslavement, we can talk about this a little bit more, but that there was in fact slavery in California, right? Not only was there almost 2,000 slaves, we learned that through some expert testimony from Professor Stacy Smith out of Oregon State University, but the state also implemented a fugitive slave law, which was actually very rare for free states. Most free states did not go out their way to implement a fugitive slave law, which empowered ordinary white citizens to deputize themselves to round up free blacks and deport them to be re-enslaved in the South or sometimes on California soil. Racial terror is the first badge or incident of slavery we identify. And again, we give a national scope and a California scope. I'll just focus in the interest of time just for California. In California, we found that California sometimes even held more KKK events than Mississippi or Louisiana. In the city of Brea, for instance, from 1924 to 1936, we found 2/3 of the fire chiefs were part of the KKK, 5 of the first 8 mayors, 6 of 10 councilmen on the board of trustees, and half of the treasurers, engineers, clerks, and marshals. The second badge or incident of slavery we identify is political disenfranchisement, right? We're articulating and we're articulating for our community what we know plagues us. That's what I really love about us, organizing this and calling these are literally badges and incidents of slavery. Political disenfranchisement. This is a picture from 1952 of African-American Republican candidate for 55th Assembly District, Rayfield Lundy, is inspecting a burnt cross outside of his home in Los Angeles as an example of political intimidation. California also passed many voter suppression laws that were used in the South as well. The third badge or incident of slavery is housing segregation. Again, this is a picture from 1952. All of these stats and pictures are from the final report. This is 2 men, African-American men, William Bailey and Roger Duncan. They look at the wreckage in Bailey's living room after a bomb exploded in the house. Duncan's house directly across the street was also bombed and at the same time, and a note was left threatening the black families on the street if they didn't move out. And so California had racially restrictive covenants, right, that segregated communities by race. They also had redlining that disinvested, created disinvestments in the African American community. And after California outlawed racially restrictive covenants in the 1950s and 60s, that's when you saw an uptick of this violence, as you see in this picture. So the next badge or incident of slavery we talk about is separate and unequal education. Nationally, non-white schools districts get $23 billion less than predominantly white districts. In California, we're the sixth most segregated state in the country, and most of our education in terms of K through 12 is fueled by property taxes. And when you talk about and you think about the state's legacy in redlining and racially restrictive covenants, it makes sense that in Black and by extension Latino communities, there's mostly renters, not too many homeowners, and all of that is going to feed into less money to fuel for property taxes to fuel schools. So this is an observation that I made recently. And then racism in the environment and infrastructure. In California, Black Californians are more likely than white Californians to live in overcrowded housing and near hazardous waste. Black neighborhoods are more likely to lack tree canopy and suffer from the consequences of water and air pollution. The next badge or incident of slavery is the pathologizing of the Black family. It's dealing with all the stereotypes that Black Americans, Black men, Black women, Black children, and persecution that the Black family has had to deal with over generations. And for instance, in terms of foster care, just an interesting note, nationwide, African Americans are 14% of the population, but we make up 23% of those in foster care. So the ninth chapter, or the next badge or incident of slavery, is control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. To the right, you see a picture of the famous singer, Little Richard. He was outside in 1984 protesting his record company because he sold the rights to the song Tutti Frutti for a reported $50, and he received half a cent for each report sold. So there's many African American artists who, talked about their experiences in this chapter about taken advantage of in terms of, intellectual property deprivation. This chapter also talks about there's over 1,000 missing patents, right? African Americans have contributed vast amounts of inventions, even since slavery, that they weren't able to actually get the credit for, right? We talk about that. We also talk about, in California specifically, how there are many examples of African American cultural and leisure sites. In California, in Southern California alone, you have Black beach resorts in Manhattan Beach. You have Black beach towns in Santa Monica. You had Sugar Hill, which was a famous African American town in LA, and Central Ave, which was a famous jazz site, or Fillmore in San Francisco. All of those leisure sites, they don't exist anymore. They're completely decimated due to unjust property takings via eminent domain, or gentrification, or the construction of freeways. So that's what this chapter goes through. The next chapter is stolen labor and hindered opportunity. In California, for instance, we found several Californian cities, despite being seen as this progressive state, even as early as 1940s, right, didn't start hiring Black workers until even 1970. In San Francisco, when the Black population in 1970 was 14%, only 4 of the department's 1,800 uniformed firefighters were Black. The next badge or incident of slavery is the unjust legal system. We talked about mass incarceration and over-policing. And in California, like the rest of the country, California stops, shoots, kills, and imprisons more African Americans than their share of the population. Despite, popular belief in the mainstream media, Black Americans remain the #1 victims of hate crimes in the United States since the nation's inception. That's what the task force found. African Americans are the #1 victims of hate crimes in the state of California, and African Americans are the #1 victims of hate crimes in the city of LA. And there was a very interesting article that came out in the LA Times recently that said, despite the fact that African Americans are the #1 victims of hate crimes in LA, the city of LA has deployed no resources towards educating the city about this. And I mean, if you look at the news, you wouldn't think that, right? You would think that Black people in LA are tearing the city up, but that doesn't tell the whole story. The next badge or incident of slavery, please excuse the graphic nature of this picture, is mental and physical harm and neglect. This is a picture of students at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in 1898. And they are pretty much mutilating an African American woman. And I want to draw your attention to not necessarily what they're doing, but what's etched across that table. Her loss is our gain. That was their, motto for this so-called experiment. Her loss is our gain. And I think that's really indicative of the African American experience in this country, to be quite honest, in terms of white supremacy. The loss of the Black American community is the gain of the greater society. And so in California, the national trends are similar. In California. There's a 7-year life expectancy gap between white Californians and Black Californians. Black babies are more likely to die in infancy. Black mothers giving birth are more likely to die than the average Californian mother. And compared to white Californians, Black Californians are more likely to have diabetes, die from cancer, or be hospitalized for heart disease, or be dealing with multiple ailments at one time. And then the last badge or incident of slavery we discuss is the wealth gap. We found that the state of California doesn't have a study that shows like the wealth gap between white Californians and Black Californians, but there is a national study. And then there is a wealth gap study specific to the city of LA. So nationally, we found, right, in 2019, white households own 9 times more assets than Black households. We found in LA, for instance, the median value of liquid assets for native-born African Americans, those descend from slaves, was just $200 compared to $110,000 for white households and $72,000 for African Blacks. I also want to point your attention to this fact up here, which is something that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. talked about many times before his assassination, right before his assassination. You know, he said something to the effect of what's on this screen, where he said, while Congress refused to give the Negro any land, at the same time was giving away hundreds of millions of acres of land to white folks for free, mostly to white families, Martin Luther King said, which meant that this country was willing to undergird its newly arriving peasant class from Europe with an economic floor while denying the same opportunity to African Americans, those descend from slaves, those who've actually been in this country even before this country was a country. When we talk about African Americans being here since 1619 and the United States being officially formed in 1776. So what are the present day implications of that? Exclusionary public policy, the federal and California Homestead Acts that Reverend Martin Luther King was discussing before he was assassinated. Well, today, as many as 46 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits of that exclusionary land transfer. That's approximately 1/4 or 25% of the adult population in the United States benefit from that exclusionary land transfer. And that's just one example of exclusionary public policy that African Americans were not able to benefit from, and thus were not able to build wealth, which is why, for instance, it'll take over 220 years nationally to close the racial wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. So just to conclude, these are just a sampling. We recommended over 100 policy recommendations for the state legislature to implement. Some of them were cash-based, but many of them were not. Most of them were not, actually. Most of them were non-cash payments related. In the areas of enslavement, we, for instance, advised or recommended that the state create a new state agency paying homage to the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed in this country. And it would provide ongoing direct reparatory justice services to descendants of slaves while also providing oversight to existing state agencies and institutions to ensure that Black Americans' rights are being abridged, kind of going back to that fifth form of reparations under international law, guarantees of non-repetition. In terms of rehabilitation, for instance, we recommended the establishment and funding of community wellness centers in Black communities and funding research to study the rising suicide rates among Black youth, who are actually now the number one victims of suicide in the state. In terms of unjust legal system, we recommended increasing efforts to restore the voting rights of formerly incarcerated folks. We recommended for folks currently incarcerated to be able to vote. And we recommended, for instance, taking out that crime exception clause that's not only in the U.S. Constitution, but also in the state constitution, and allows folks who are locked up to be slaves in this state. And if that passes, that'll apply to any and everyone who's incarcerated, not just Black Americans who descend from slaves, right? And then also we recommend, in terms of education, free college tuition to descendants of slaves at state colleges and state universities like UCLA. And then for housing segregation, we recommended, for instance, providing property tax relief to descendants living in formerly redlined neighborhoods. We recommended providing shared appreciation loans and subsidized down payments, mortgages, and homeowners insurance to help increase home ownership. As we know, that is one of the primary ways to build wealth in this country and in this state. So that is the end of our presentation. I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with Dr. Stevenson and you all. Even though the task force is officially over, I was saying that the website that is housed by the California DOJ Civil Rights Enforcement Section team, that's the team that helped us with this project, the website is going to remain on their website forever. So if folks are interested in watching past hearings, looking at the past materials, you can go to that website. Also, grassroots organizers are starting to come together to just continue to keep this conversation going. And so I recommend folks go to californiareparations.info and you can subscribe to the mailing list there for updates if you want to stay involved and get engaged. You can also find any of these past hearings on the California DOJ's YouTube page as well, even if you don't want to go to the website. And then you can, follow me on my website or on Twitter, and that's my Instagram and TikTok handle too. So I'll just conclude by saying, and I bring this up a lot, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is someone that I look up to, in his seminal case for reparations published in The Atlantic, I believe it was like 2014, he made a very astute observation that African Americans, we have been enslaved in this country longer than we've actually been free. And then Isabel Wilkerson, who also is an esteemed author, kind of expounded on that and said it wouldn't be like, I guess it would be another 100 years until there's actually like a parity between the amount of years that African Americans have been free and enslaved in this country. So we have a lot of work to be done. I feel like we're just in a massive kind of gaslighting campaign. 3 short years after the racial reckoning of George Floyd's murder, you're having people saying like, we don't need reparations and all this other stuff. But just putting all that into context, what Ta-Nehisi Coates and even what Isabel Wilkerson is saying, I just want folks to kind of drown out the noise from the naysayers and understand, reparations is an idea whose time has come and it's a debt that's overdue. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and first of all, I want to say thank you to Kamilah and to the task force. This is a magnificent effort. I've read a lot of historical documents, and this is absolutely one of the best ones I've ever seen. It is so inclusive. It's tremendous that this document was able to come together in such a short period of time, so long overdue. Yeah, so first of all, and thank you for being the chairperson of the task force. What an honor, but also a responsibility. And thank you for staying the course and doing this work and continuing to do it, even though now, people aren't shining bright lights on it anymore. We're not talking about it and that kind of thing. So I want to ask you, um, where do we go from here? I mean, what kinds, in order to have these recommendations implemented in our society in California, but perhaps as also very strong suggestion and recommendation for the rest of the nation and the rest of the Atlantic world, where Black people have been enslaved and have never benefit from the labor of their ancestors or their own labor equitably. Where do we go from here in terms of making sure these recommendations get placed into law and get done in the state of California?
Thank you for that question. So where do we go from here? So January most likely is going to be the month that California state legislators are going to be able to introduce our recommendations into legislation. Senator Stephen Bradford, who served on the task force, he's a state senator. He was able to introduce what's called SB 490 into the state legislature actually about a month or so ago on a technicality, because SB 490, as it was originally written, it would have extended the life of the task force to allow us to continue to socialize a final report from now until the next year. He gutted that language to then just include the language from our final report, the recommendation to create the new state agency. Because the idea was we did a monumental task. We completed our work. We did our interim report. We did our final report. Our mission was done, so we didn't necessarily need to be assembled as a 9-member task force any longer. And so his idea was, let me just gut that out and just put in the language of one of our recommendations to keep the conversation going, to keep the momentum going. And so SB 490, as a gut and amend, that would create the California Freedmen Affairs Agency, which is one of the major recommendations from the task force. But to your point, legislators won't be able to debate that legislation until January or February 2024, and they most likely won't be able to introduce any new legislation until that time as well. So we're probably not going to see any real movement from the legislatures until January 2024. But I hear from the California Legislative Black Caucus that they're super excited and eager, and they're already planning to even introduce like a comprehensive reparation bill package based on all of those recommendations. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's incredible. I saw in the report that 60% of Californians believe that Black people in California deserve some form of reparations, and that's the majority of people in California. And so, but we do also know that there's a vocal minority of people who don't want this to happen. So, one of the things that very much impressed me about the report was that you built in that educational piece, that um, all of that narrative about what the history is, so that people could understand where the notion of reparations is founded. All right. So when people come to you and say, you know, why should Black people get reparations when all these other people have had traumas, etc., and you're not, and they're not, or we're not getting reparations? What are you saying?
Yes, so to your point, so two of the task force members, Don Tamaki and Cheryl Grills, they were part of the Public Education Committee. And so in the final report, there's a chapter on, common questions and common responses. And just to kind of like educate folks, and if folks want to like read that chapter and then kind of go spread the gospel, they kind of are prepared with some responses to the common questions. And so to your point, one of the common questions in that chapter is, well, Black Americans aren't the only groups of people who have been marginalized and have dealt with harms or who may be owed reparations. And I believe Don Tamaki and Cheryl Grills essentially just concluded by saying, no, that's true, right? We can hold space for several different communities, but we have to understand that the Black American experience, those who descend from slaves, is a very unique experience. No other group has been enslaved on U.S. soil for 255 years. No other group after that has been subjected to 90 plus years of legal subjugation. No other group after that has really had to bear the brunt in dealing with the legacy of slavery and those badges and incidents of slavery that have really permeated through the society, but it's really impacted, descendants of slaves the most. So,
Right.
We're not saying that, other groups aren't entitled, but we're saying, this is a unique story and a unique history that deserves unique repair.
Absolutely. But one of the things that really impressed me too was your recommendation that the school system take up the education and that the school system absolutely include this information in its curriculum. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. So one of the recommendations, and the task force has already started to do this before we sunset, we hired a couple of professors from UC Berkeley to help us to develop a curriculum that, if passed, through the legislature, would be adopted through like K through 12 curriculum. So we're already working on that with the UC Berkeley professors.
Okay, so let's get to the nitty gritty. How much money am I going to get? No, I'm only teasing, but I want sort of. But I wanted to find out, how does this play out in the average African American's life?
So in terms of compensation, when we started talking about compensation as a task force, that's when like Fox News and Breitbart and Daily Mail, they just started really like paying close attention to the task force and really distorting what the task force came up with. And I feel like we're still kind of dealing with that today, where even people who don't read those publications probably kind of have this idea in their mind. And the mainstream headline was, oh, the task force recommended the state give $1.2 million to every Black person. By show of hands, who heard that? I'm just curious.
I did hear that. I got excited.
That's not
very
true.
excited.
The task force did not recommend that. Or one of the headlines was like, oh, the task force recommends the state give Black Americans like $800 billion like in the next fiscal year. Like, that's not what the task force recommended. This is what the task force did, and it's very boring. We hired 5 economists and public policy experts to help us calculate the monetary losses over time of the African American community across several different areas. They were able to just focus on 5 within that very short amount of time. They were able to gather enough data for just 5 to make a claim that the state of California owes reparations in the form of cash in those 5 particular areas, because there was evidence to show that the state either excluded people through exclusionary public policy or discriminated African Americans through exclusionary public policy. So just to conclude, those 5 areas are health harms, devaluation of Black businesses, mass incarceration over policing, unjust property takings, and housing segregation. So those are the 5 areas where the 5 economists and public policy experts were able to gather data to show, look, the state of California is culpable in perpetuate discrimination against Black Americans in those 5 areas, and they were able to quantify the discrimination in monetary losses. So just to conclude, I know it's a little confusing, but to conclude, the task force, through our economists and public policy experts, found that over time, the Black American community has lost $800 billion in revenue and wealth building potential across those 5 areas due to the actions of the state in and of itself. And so what the task force is recommending is the state legislature read Chapter 17. That's where all those formulas and all the breakdown is. And then it's up to the state legislature to prescribe an actual monetary amount based on that methodology that we came up with. So it's kind of hard to answer your question like, oh, how much are we gonna get? It really is up to the state legislature, depending on if they adopt, our methodology and the extent to which they do. If they do, it could look like up to $1.2 million per person, or it could look like something different. And per person, I mean per descendant of a free and enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900.
Wow, that sounds exciting. I'm just very excited about that. Can I think about anything else? No, I'm just so no. But I wanted to ask you. So this is looking at 5 different categories. But when you were showing your PowerPoint presentation, there were many categories, 19, 20, something like that. So are these economists going back and also going to do that cost analysis for those other categories as well?
That's a brilliant question, and that is something that the new state agency, if it's actually formed and passed into law, the economists in that Chapter 17 pretty much recommended, look, we weren't able to gather enough data across all those badges and incidents of slavery that the task force identified. We were only able to gather enough data to make a solid argument and claim for 5, but they recommended that the new state agency, which tentatively would have a data collection branch, that branch would be doing that cost benefit analysis and doing the formulas for all the other badges and incidents of slavery that we weren't able to have enough time to actually do the calculations for.
Okay, I understand that. One question that came to mind was, and I wasn't able to read the entire 1,000-page report. Okay, so I'm gonna
either.
rely on you to give me this information. In the report, do you all talk about the amount of income that was produced by enslaved people?
We do. I mean, nationally, we talk about, for instance, that the infrastructure of this country, by and large, is built by slave infrastructure that still exists today, like the White House and the Capitol. And to your point, we talk about the revenue that slaves generated. We even had Thomas Kramer, who's a public policy professor, part of our team, and he even brought up his research in terms of reparations. He came up with like quadrillion figure just based on I guess you could say like lost wages of slaves, just for slavery in and of itself. We had a team member even saying like there's quadrillion in terms of lost wages for slaves. But I would love to hear your thoughts too.
Well, the thing is that I think few people know or think about the fact that the work that enslaved people did begin the economies, whether or not you're looking at Wall Street, whether or not you're looking at the insurance industry, whether or not you're looking at the agricultural or agrarian economies that were built, shipbuilding, of course, all the things that happened that allowed for the slave trade. The United States built more, people in the United States built more slave ships than in any other country. That we provided 75% of the cotton worldwide, in 1860, 75%, 80% of the cotton that went to industrialized England came from cotton picked by enslaved people in the United States. There's, more than that in terms of our industrialization, the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And so I think it's very hard for people to understand, the federal government benefiting from the taxes of enslaved, you had to pay tax on your enslaved people. Newspapers lived off of the advertisements for fugitive slaves and the selling of slaves. So almost every place we live, lawyers, of course, were used by slaveholders to purchase enslaved people and make those contracts. Finance the things that were sent abroad that were the goods that we exported outside of cotton. As well too. So, when we look at the ways in which the wealth was produced in the nation, prior to the Civil War, and then even after the Civil War, as well as Black people were forced back into the fields as sharecroppers, as renters, etc., were underpaid, underemployed, etc., and forced labor of children, people in the chain gang, and all this other kind of stuff that was going on. It's incredible that people get really nervous about how much wealth would it take to reimburse the Black population for all that was done to start the nation and to help the nation become the great nation that it is. And I think people also forget that, that throughout the Atlantic world, enslaved holders were reimbursed for when emancipation came. For example, those people in Britain who owned enslaved people in the Caribbean were given what is today would be $30 billion when they freed. Same for those people who in France, in the French Caribbean, etc. And Abraham Lincoln, that was his plan, was to reimburse slaveholders. Of course, he was assassinated, and the plan never came to be. So the notion of reparations It's not a new one, but in the 19th century, it primarily was centered on, slaveholders trying to be paid by the federal government for quote unquote taking away their property. And so, it's something very interesting to think about when we think about this particular issue. But I do want to give people a chance in the audience to answer questions.
Yeah, I
Oh,
have a quick
please.
thought. So, from an international law perspective, my observation to that, when you're like across the Atlantic world, slaveholders received reparations. And from an international law perspective, reparations, before it took a human rights centered approach, it was about what nations owed nations, particularly
Right.
what losing nations owed to winning nations after war. So
Right.
you would think if that's an understood concept, then it would be the Confederates as the losing side who should have been paying reparations to the Union, but that's not how it went.
No, it's not how it went. And when the Confederate States of America formed in 1861, in terms of world nations, they were ranked number 7 in terms of their wealth, and the United States of America was ranked 11th. And that would tell you something about the value of enslaved black bodies, because that's a huge part of the wealth, but also of the cotton crop that they were producing that was going to be sold internationally, that helped to amass this status as a world power, a world financial power at that moment. Yeah. So, at any rate, so we're going to open it up now for questions, and does somebody have these microphones in the audience so I can't see because the lights are right in my eyes. But if you have a question, please do raise your hand, and someone will come up. Yes, this person right here has a question. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Moore, for the work you've done on the task force and for being here tonight to give us a summary. You'll forgive this tangential association, but I'm sitting here thinking about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And they changed the attitudes and the culture about drinking and driving almost overnight. And I'm wondering if the task force has considered some kind of public relations campaign akin to that. I'm looking for a reparations billboard in Westwood or a commercial on TV or something on my computer or something to interrupt my day on my text, like, every other political campaign that comes through. I'm wondering if you guys have thought about that.
Thank you. That's a great question. And we had conversations around community engagement and public relations as a task force. But again, the California DOJ, they were the ones giving us assistance and kind of giving us legal advice. And we even had a conversation about, like, we wanted to earmark funds for billboards and things like that. And essentially the DOJ was saying we weren't allowed to. I don't know why. But we just had a lot of struggles when it came to public relations and community engagement, to be quite honest with you. But I know in talks with the California Legislative Black Caucus, they actually are already in early conversations around allocating some resources to do a public education campaign. So that's what I can share.
Well, I think that's an excellent, absolute excellent recommendation, because, I mean, this room should be full. This room should absolutely be full. And we cannot let, now that the report is done, we cannot let the recommendations just fall by the wayside because nobody knows about it, nobody's thinking about it, nobody's talking about it at this time. So, oftentimes wonderful things are done to move us forward as a people and as a nation. And then what happens is all these little blocks are put in place, and before you know it, that those initiatives have disappeared. In the next 25 years, they crop up again. So we have to make sure that that does not happen this time. So somebody else has that. Oh, you have your hand up. Yes. Yes, you. Oh, there was a person up there too. I'm sorry. If I don't call on you, just scream out because I really cannot see you. Oh, okay. All right then. Then I can turn my. Okay. Thank you, Claudia.
Hi. Thank you, folks, for being here tonight. I really appreciate all the presentation that was presented. It was very informative. My question is regarding if the task force ever investigated or looked into resources for tracing the genealogy of U.S. Black Americans who maybe are finding it difficult to see if their ancestry is tied to slavery. I think right now resources would be, the oral history that's passed down generationally, maybe mail-in DNA services to trace that ancestry, but was anything explored by the task force, or is it a matter of self-identifying? I'm just really curious.
Thank you. That's a really great question. So I think Claudia alluded to this in her opening remarks, that when the task force had a really kind of hard conversation about like who should be eligible for reparations, and it was a 10-month like debate around that question, and unfortunately it seemed like it was two camps, like, oh, should it be like a race-based standard, so like all Black people regardless of origin, regardless of whether you had ancestors enslaved in the country, or should it be what we're calling like lineage-based or specific? So those who are descendants of slaves, those who were descendants of enslaved Africans who were forced to labor in the United States. So we invited 6 expert genealogists to help to provide expert testimony on like the feasibility of this lineage-based standard if the task force went with it, including Hollis Gentry, who's like the lead genealogist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And we also invited Assembly Member Secretary of State Shirley Weber to give expert testimony because we were just at a standstill around like this question. And she pretty much said when she brought this bill to mind, she had a lineage-specific criteria in mind. Not only descendants of slaves, but also descendants of free Blacks who were living in this country prior to 1900, because, free Blacks, they also, in her what she articulated, still had to navigate a very precarious society. Even California, you had free Blacks in the California conventions, right? Having to secure their rights as free Blacks and things like that. So, but just to conclude, the 6 expert genealogists, you would assume because they're genealogists, they would have come to testify and say, yes, we're for a lineage-based standard. But that was like a really arduous panel, because the genealogists, they were really kind of litigating the feasibility of it. And we ended up having to take a vote towards the end, a poll of all the genealogists. Are you guys for a race-based standard because lineage is just too hard, or are you for a lineage-specific standard? And 5 of the 6 genealogists said a lineage-specific standard is feasible with ample resources from the state. And so that's kind of the extent that the task force kind of went in terms of, concluding, okay, we'll do a lineage-based standard, but one of our recommendations is the creation of that new state agency, paying homage to the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed in this country. I think W.E. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, I learned very recently, he said that the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to be a permanent institution. It was never supposed to be temporary. And so that's kind of like this new state agency that we're recommending kind of pays homage to that. It's a permanent state resource where descendants of slaves can get ongoing reparatory justice services, but one of those branches would be a genealogy office. That's actually the first branch that folks would have to interact with. Board-certified genealogists will be a part of that agency and helping folks, because the idea is, the task force concluded, and I'll conclude, that the burden of proof, so to speak, should not rest on the individual. It should really rest on the state. The state should have the resources to help people navigate that. And I'll conclude by saying, recently I had a talk with some Black Brazilians. There's a Diva Moreira. She's a very famous activist in Brazil. And I drove down to San Diego State University this past week to hear her talk about her fight for reparations in Brazil. And I learned from the Brazilians after, when we went to dinner, that they have racial quotas. They have affirmative action. And on top of that, they have racial quotas for education and stuff like that, and it's race-based. So they were telling me that there's committees where you have to go and show and prove your Blackness, and it's self-declared, right? So it's like, okay, I'm Black, I want free education or whatever. You have to go to a committee and show yourself a proof, show that you're black. And they were saying that it can get really toxic and problematic because they'll be looking at your skin color, they'll be looking at the width of your nose, they'll be looking at your lips, and it can get really problematic. And that's one of the arguments where I was like, we don't want a race-based standard here because it's going to have to be self-declared, and then you're going to have, it's just going to be a mess. And so, counterintuitively, when we packaged the argument lineage versus race, a lot of people were like, oh, lineage, that's too divisive, that's too complicated, when really it's the race-based standard that can get really divisive and really messy.
And I just want to add to that, too, that I think that it's a little bit, Brazil is very different from the United States because they've always had 16 categories of people between black and white, including indigenous and, too. So they've always had 16 categories. And so they've always been very colorist focused in a way in terms of the state itself, not just your family members, but, but the state itself. The other thing about Brazil that we don't have, unfortunately, is that because it was Catholic, predominantly Catholic, then they have birth and death records that go all the way back to the 16th century. And so it's much easier actually to claim your descent from an enslaved person because the Catholic Church was very careful, even in rural areas, to note the people who were born and that kind of thing. But there is a new project that's coming out of University of Boston College, in which this is called the Enslaved Naming Project, where people are they've got a huge grant from the federal government and some other agencies, and they're trying to actually reestablish families by finding all the names, going through the plantation records, but also going through the federal census, by also going through, oral traditions, oral stories, etc., to put together black families from the beginning, from 1619. And some of those families still exist because I know one family exists in Hampton, Virginia that arrived in 1619. So, but anyway, they're working very diligent on doing that. And so there are these different pieces of the puzzle that are out there. They have to be united. Okay, and I'm hoping your Freedmen Agency will be one of the uniting forces. Yeah, so this man, do you still have a question? Yes, okay.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. I guess my question pertains to the facts. And historically, going back to the Neolithic period, 11,000, 12,000 years ago, there have been slaves. Slaves have been part of every culture, like it or not. Muslims were slaves to Christians. Christians were slaves to Muslims. It existed in Asia. It existed in Africa. And I've heard a lot of talk tonight about the overall condition of a community. However, we're focusing on California. Like you, I'm an attorney, so I look at this from a legal perspective, which is where much of the foundation is. Factually speaking, and I'm curious to know how the panel addresses this, factually speaking, California became, because that's what we have to focus on, California, because we're talking about getting money from the state for reparations. And the reality is, whether you call it restitution or otherwise, it's still money. So the state became a state in 1850. The state's constitution forbids slavery. In 1850, the population of the entire state, according to the US Census, was about 92.5 thousand people. That's the population of Santa Monica. Now imagine Santa Monica's population spread across the entire state of California, of which experts that I've read said up to maybe 1,500 people were slaves. And you indicated maybe up to 2,000, which no matter how you look at it is a very small number. And it was very short-lasted as well, if nothing else for commercial reasons, because the miners didn't like the idea of people from the South coming in with free labor to compete with them. So we have case law from that you mentioned, the fugitive case law. The fugitive case law actually failed because several cases were brought in the early 1850s, and every time the court sided with the slave, and against the white slaveholder, except for the Perkins case. But in 1855, the legislature let that statute lapse. So it was no longer a good law. The first senator was an advocate, and he was an abolitionist. And he was also one of the first people to run on an anti-slavery campaign. So my family came to America in the early 1900s. If you look at the math, only 92,000 people were in California at the time of potential slavery in California. And it was de minimis at that point. The vast majority of people in this state, and this is where I think the problem is going to be for your legislation efforts, did not come here during slavery. The vast majority of people like me going, I had nothing to do with it. Sorry, folks, I had nothing to do with it. And most people I've met, good luck finding out if their family was originally in, as you said, it's the genealogy, not the color of your skin really is an issue. So how do you address the population? And I was here for the Frank Gehry lecture, and I couldn't get in. The lines were around the building. I came here tonight at like 5 or 6 because I'm like, there's going to be a huge crowd. This is going to be such a controversial thing. I was shocked to see people weren't coming out on both sides. And maybe that's another problem, that you don't have people and saying, where's my $1 million? And I think a lot of and how do you respond to a lot of the population saying, this is, and to your point, 60% of NPR's poll said Californians were against the reparations. NPR is not a right-wing media outlet, with 13% abstaining from giving their opinion. So the majority is not in favor of it. So this is a big uphill. And you mentioned the people who had cotton, they were given money for losing their slaves. So has there been any thought, this is the second part of the question, since I didn't have slaves, none of my ancestors had slaves, we weren't here in the 1800s, and most of the people in the state didn't have slaves or were not here in the 1800s, why not focus your legislation on saying the people who are the ancestors of slaveholders get their money from the ancestors of the people who had the slaves and benefited, as opposed to spreading it across the board, because that's the logical part. So how do you overcome that? Because if you're trying to literally get this passed in the legislature, these are the hurdles you're going to face. Another hurdle I might mention, and you're an attorney, if you had a jury of 9, well, just one, but this is your panel. Your panel consisted of 9 people, but they were all African American except for one. If you were a lawyer and you represented an African American client and had a jury of all white people, wouldn't that be the first thing people would point to and say, I don't buy your panel because your panel didn't have any other races except for one other person. So those are things that I'm curious to know and how you'd respond to, because at the end of the day, we can all sit here and say, oh, we wish we had this, but you've got to get it through the legislature.
I just want to say thank you for your question. I just want to say really quickly, and I know you're going to address this, a couple of things. First of all, the poll that I saw did not say the same thing as your NPR poll, and so my poll was taken from your right, from your, so you can tell them exactly what poll it is. Secondarily, the task force has not been about just slavery. The task force has been about slavery and then everything that happened after slavery, which included segregation, Jim Crow, lynching, house bombs, being excluded from equitable educational resources, being excluded from land ownership. And so those immigrant families that are coming in, for example, are being offered, as was showed on the slide, free land or land for very little, when black people are not allowed to have that. So it's not just about what happened with slavery. It is about what happened after slavery, and it also is about the fact that the 200 and so years where slavery was in effect and legal in this country, it created a great nation economically, politically, and it allowed immigrants to come in afterwards and to benefit from that foundation and those resources and those opportunities that immigrants coming after the era of slavery were able to take advantage of and move up very quickly into another class, into another sector of our society, having access to education, have access to health care, have access to voting, have access to fair trials, etc.
Thank you.
I literally dropped the mic.
Drop the mic, great. And I'll just corroborate everything that she said. And in fact, the task force
most of the recommendations, it's about the legacy of slavery. Our justification for reparations is about the legacy of slavery, the lingering badges and incidents of slavery. We focus on, for instance, California's unique history in enslavement and being one of the only free states to enact the fugitive slave law, no matter how short, just to disrupt this myth and narrative that California was a free state. And we talk about slavery on a national context because, as I said earlier, we're the first state in the nation to do this work. The United States hasn't done this work either, so we understood our scope and our role in this moment, and we wanted to talk about not only the legacy of slavery, but of course the foundation, which is slavery in and of itself, but the justification, the argument for reparations in the state of California is not necessarily even about slavery. It's about the legacy of slavery. It's about those lingering badges and incidents of slavery. It's about those stats and data points that I talked about earlier and what she talked about as well. For instance, like I said, the Federal and California Homestead Act, that's an exclusionary public policy that went majority to white Americans that still have present day implications today. Over 40 million, almost 25% of the white adult population living today. Many of these people are white immigrants, people who were not present in the United States during slavery. Still today reap the wealth benefits of that exclusionary land transfer, either still have that land that California or the federal government gave for pennies on the dollar and excluded the opportunity for African Americans, or it's a part of their generational wealth because they sold it. Like, that's one example. And the 10th chapter, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, I literally showed a slide of the various different types of white immigrants who were here in the 50s and 60s who had the same amount of skills, if not less, than Black Americans, but were getting more money at their jobs than African Americans. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about in the state of California didn't ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments until the late 50s. We're talking about how the state, we found through our economists and public policy experts that the state redlined our communities from 1933 to 1977. And we came up with a calculation as to how much the Black American community has lost due to that exclusionary public policy, due to the actions of the state itself, right? Being relegated to the projects and not being allowed to freely move in the country that we built so that we could build wealth in the one and only really ways that you can build wealth in this country, and that's through home ownership. I think one of the last things that I'll say is, you can say that, yes, slavery was all over the world, but slavery was very unique here, right? It was very unique here. It was hereditary, right? There was something called like partus sequitur ventrum, right? Slavery was born through the mother. If you were born to a Black woman, you were from conception deemed to be a slave. Like, that was not necessarily, or really that was unique to the United States. In other societies, being a slave was not hereditary. It's something that you could ascend out of. For Black Americans, that was not the case.
Well, what I'd like to say about that is that I wrote a book in 2015 called What is Slavery? The first chapter deals with the fact that slavery has existed since the early period, and it has existed in every society. All my lectures deal with, all my classes, when I begin my lectures, I begin with that. We look at Greece, we look at Rome, we look at, slavery existed in Asia, it existed in North America prior to European contact, in South America as well, in Europe, of course, in Africa as well. And so, yeah, it is a part of world of our lives. It's a part of the world history. It exists today in our society. I mean, there are at least 30 million people who are enslaved in the world today. It's never going to disappear. But that doesn't give us a reason not to deal with an issue, not to deal with a problem. The other thing, too, is that there are not a lot of people here today. There's a lot of things happening, and we have to make certain that this stays in people's purview, that they get focused on it. But what I like to tell my students, and I'll say it to this audience, because we oftentimes feel like initiatives like this that make the nation better can't move forward, okay? Cannot move forward. We just, that's too much. It's not going to happen. In 1830, there were 2 million black people enslaved in the United States. In 1860, there were 4 million black people enslaved in the United States. In 1830, the organized abolitionist movement began in the United States. And the United States by 1860 was the largest slave society in the Americas, larger than Brazil, okay? And nobody thought in 1830, when the abolitionist movement became organized, that it would end slavery 35 years later. And it did, okay? And so, the Civil War, the turn in the Civil War was not just because of military might or military losses, in terms of Lincoln having to employ, black soldiers, in terms of black people, and black people were taking their freedom, but it was also because the ground was set through the abolitionist movement that only began 30 years prior. And so anything can happen in this country. Anything has happened in this country. And it's just the will of the people to do the freaking right thing. Whether or not it's cash, and, thank God I'm employed. I don't need cash. Okay, I can't say that for my ancestors because I do know that they struggled. My father was fired from one of his jobs because he couldn't be a supervisor over white people at that job. Okay, so everybody has a story like that. But what I'm saying is that looking at your figures, looking at the historical truth, and looking at the will of the people as they continue to reflect on this issue, this can happen. And it should happen in some way, shape, or form. And it has happened. And you have lots of examples of it happening in this country and also globally.
And the last thing I'll say is the Berkeley Intergovernmental Studies poll was released about a month or so ago. They polled 6,030 registered voters, a mix of political ideology. Many of them were moderates as well. And there were 3 questions asked. Do you think the state is doing too much, too little, or just enough for black people? And the other question was, do you think that black Americans are still dealing with the legacy of slavery? And the other question was, have you heard about the task force and the work that they did over the 2 years? And then the last question was, what do you think about cash payments? Do you agree with that recommendation? So out of the 6,030 people polled, the majority of people said that the state is doing too little for black people. That's actually a positive, right? That the state, a majority of folks polled, and they extrapolated that to say majority of Californians believe that the state is doing too little for black people. Across counties, I think the only county that said the state is doing too much for black people was Riverside County. On the question of, do you think that the legacy of slavery still exists and is still affecting black Americans, the majority of folks polled said yes, the legacy of slavery still exists and is still predominantly affecting black Americans. So that's 2 silver linings from the poll that did not get mainstream news. One, majority of Californians think the state is doing too little for black people. The majority of Californians believe that the legacy of slavery still persists and still affects black Americans. The majority of those polled knew about the task force, but when it came to that last question about do you agree with cash payments, 59% said they were against it. But when you really disaggregate the data, it was really the Republicans that were bringing those numbers down. It was 94% of conservatives were strongly against it, but there were 6% of Republicans who were for it, so that's good. But in the top 2 reasons for why the majority of folks were against it, and then majority of Democrats actually were in favor, but it just doesn't seem like that when you see that 59% in total are against it because of the Republicans drawing the numbers down so much.
Excuse me, but against cash payments, but all forms of reparations?
The question was just about cash payments.
Because I think in the slide that I saw was just reparations.
Yes. So
So is that saying that 60%, as this young man said, 60% are opposed to all forms of reparations?
No, in the Berkeley IGS poll, it was just cash reparations.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'll apologize if I made a mistake in reading the poll. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, there's several different polls. But essentially, that's just so. What I'm saying is, the majority of Californians are actually in support of reparations. They understand that the state is doing too little. They understand the legacy of slavery still affects Black Americans. They just don't agree with the cash part. And the two strongest arguments against the cash part was what we talked about before was what about other groups who've been marginalized, and then the taxpayer burden argument. And we have in the task force final report in our chapter on public responses, we have cookie cutter answers to all those questions. It's really just about, in this next year or so, working with legislators, community organizations, multicultural organizations and institutions through public education campaign, and just continue to thoughtfully address those two arguments, because if we thoughtfully address those two arguments within the next year or so, I think we will see, of course, no matter what, some form of reparations in this next upcoming year. But maybe if we do this right, hopefully, we can even see cash payments in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
But doesn't the federal government have to share part of the burden of the California taxpayer?
Yes. So, and one of our final recommendations was actually to transmit our final report to the Biden administration and to U.S. Congress. And that was one of our recommendations last year when we published our interim report. And a reporter actually asked Biden's press secretary last year whether Biden was aware of the task force, had received our report. And Corinne said, yes, actually we have. Karen Pierre said, yes, actually we have. We are aware of the task force. We understand the work they're doing. We have the report. That's the last time we heard from them was last year. But I guess I'll conclude by saying the statute that created the task force, AB 3121, there's a provision in there that says, in the event that the state of California meets out reparations to descendants of slaves, the federal government, you're still on the hook. I know that's not necessarily the import of the question you were asking.
No, it is actually, because I do know that the nation, just as slavery impacted California, but people in California who were enslaved also impacted the nation. So it's not just, what was done in California. It's this part of the larger national economy that's been benefited from enslaved labor, whether it's in California, South Carolina, Maryland, wherever it was, and it's a part of that too. Yeah. Well, thank you all so very much for coming out. I wish there were more people, but I'm glad you all came and voiced your ideas, and we got to talk about some things here. I do hope that you all will continue to follow this initiative and to support it. And to tell other people about it, and to ask them to look at the websites that deal with it, and ask them to talk to their representatives, governmental representatives, to gain their support of it as well. And I want to thank Kamilah again for chairing this wonderful task force, for producing this magnificent document, and for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Yes. CJEC, Coalition for a Just and Equitable California.